the Mississippi sound was explored by countless artists in music. But only a few managed to get the sound across the globe and into the mainstream charts. One of those artists is Creedence Clearwater Revival. The Rock and Roll Hall of Famers were an incredibly popular band in the late 60s and the early 70s. However, their sound would live on for generations to come.
For me, this is the best time.
And they were not only one of the best groups in America, but they were absolutely unique.
Creedence's music you can dance to, you can rock to, you always want to turn it up, and just like that howl, it's not a voice, it is a howl. John Fogerty, just like he has a way of conjuring just like this depth and emotion. It's just like it is so soulful.
Ranked by Rolling Stone magazine as one of the top 100 artists in music's history, they achieved worldwide success with their southern rock style. Their music is still a staple of American and worldwide radio airplay. With over 26 million albums sold in the US alone, Creedence Clearwater Revival conquered a legion of fans the world over and are one of the most beloved bands in rock.
Creedence did 5 albums in less than 2 years. That's nearly 50 songs recorded, all of which pretty much, with the exception of a few on the last album, Mardi Gras, were of the highest caliber. They did 3 albums in 1969 alone. That's just remarkable. I mean, to have that turnover at that quality is just a phenomenon.
But their lasting success was built on a bumpy road, and the group would break up never to reunite. Eventually, their legacy would outlive the band. Personal egos, family disputes, and even the US military fill the story of this legendary band, but their journey would have countless highs. We welcome you to the story, the legacy, and the music of CCR. Los Angeles is a city buzzing with talent and scintillating stars. All kinds of awards ceremonies for the entertainment industry are held every year in this sunny Californian city. And in 1993, for the first time ever, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction ceremony was held in the City of Angels. Fittingly for Hollywood, it was also the first time that the induction ceremony had the participation of an actor. Billy Crystal gave a funny and emotional speech about his music producer uncle, Milt Gabler. This was the year of the announcement for plans of the construction of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and Museum in Cleveland. It was a grand induction ceremony. Artists like Etta James, The Doors, and Van Morrison were some of the inductees. The audience was buzzing with anticipation, not only for the rumored performance of Cream, the first in over 20 years, but also for a possible reunion of Creedence Clearwater Revival. The stage was set, a grand ceremony, an audience of the musical elite and the Hall of Fame induction. The remaining 3 members of the group, John Fogerty, Stu Cook, and Doug Clifford, were present and even tipped to perform. Tricia Fogerty, the widow of the late Tom Fogerty, even brought the urn with his ashes to the ceremony. When it came to the much-anticipated moment, John Fogerty barred Cook and Clifford from the stage and instead performed CCR songs with Bruce Springsteen and Robbie Robertson.
With the passing of time, the sort of historical image of Creedence was of essentially a one-man band, of a single auteur with 3 guys in the background who essentially laid down the carpet on top of which he built everything. But I guess the rancor relating to their final year or two and their breakup and the events of immediately after that breakup meant that Fogerty didn't want to share the stage with any of them or any of their relatives or even the ashes of a deceased member.
The whole rifts between John Fogerty and the other three members of the band, let's not forget it wasn't just Stu Cook and Doug Clifford who fell out with him, it was also Tom Fogerty who fell out. Goes way back to the beginning of, well, actually the end of the 60s, when Fogerty himself, John, the younger one of the two, decided to take complete control of the band. He felt the only way this band could succeed, and he wanted them to succeed, was on his terms. He wrote everything, he produced everything, he made all the business decisions. And from speaking myself to Cook and Clifford a few years ago, they've never forgiven him for that because they believe he made a lot of bad business decisions. Not decisions which adversely affected them but not him, but decisions which adversely affected all of them because they basically said he was an incompetent. And as a result of that, there was a massive falling out, which was exaggerated and exacerbated a couple of years later after Tom Fogerty left, when they did their final album, Mardi Gras, when John Fogerty went against everything he'd stood for previously and said the only way he'd do that album is if each of the three members of the band, that's him, Cook and Clifford, wrote equally, and that he only would play guitar on their tracks and they had to sing and play everything else. So that really heightened the problem between them, and it's never ever gone away.
I mean, the fact that Fogerty, he didn't just want to not be in the same room with those guys, that he actually performed Creedence without those guys on stage, it just seems incredible. What a slap in the face, but it's obvious that it was a very personal decision. The rift that existed between him and his former bandmates wasn't going to be cured, and he just couldn't force himself to do it. So in a way, it feels like, well, isn't that something? You know, just like this guy receiving this accolade, but still possessed by this integrity, this inability to compromise. I don't think it was his choice. I just think he was actually physically unable to do it, and it showed.
The bad blood between the surviving members of one of the greatest bands of all time was very visible, and it traced back over 20 years. Their relationship was broken, and the emotions were running strong. Having split up in the early 70s, Creedence Clearwater Revival have been in and out of the courts, suing and countersuing each other and their former management. The situation was critical, and many didn't understand the anger toward each other. But to understand their battles and struggles, we have to know their background, their story, and their life. The 1940s were troubled years. Half the decade was spent under the dark blanket of war. It was one of the darkest times in human history. In Europe, it was a decade of destruction, anguish, and evil. By 1945, Europe was on its knees, and the recent discoveries of the Nazi concentration camps made news all over the world. The U.S. was recovering from its war losses and healing its wounds. And it's in this climate that our story starts.
The members of Creedence were essentially born into an era in which America had won the war and was now about to turn on its primary ally and establish another war which fortunately didn't involve too much shooting. It was a time of an incredible mixture of complacency because, yay, we won the war, we're number one. Oh yeah, a couple of those other countries helped, but yeah, no big deal. And paranoia, it's like, now we got to take all these guns and tilt them over here, and the world is divided again in another way, and this time it's us and our little friends versus the Soviet Union and its little friends. So, as I say, complacency and paranoia, which is an incredibly toxic mixture.
Well, post-war USA was in a state of flux and change. Up until that point, of course, there was the entertainment industry was a huge corporation, entrepreneurial. It was certainly in Hollywood terms run by major studios who had every big star under contract. And in musical terms as well, it was very much dominated by a select few figures. When the war ended, it was the start of a sea change, which led to the uprising of the teenager. Now, of course, the teenager, as we know, it really came into the road in the 1950s with rock and roll. But even before that, the likes of Frank Sinatra were getting the teeny bop fans. So it was an exciting time because you could see that entertainment per se and music in particular was definitely in a state of change, and that other influences were starting to come in, and that what has been seen before as a whitening of black music was suddenly becoming a wider prospect in terms of people were accepting black musicians and black music on its own terms, not on terms of what whites could do to make it diluted and more acceptable to the masses.
John Fogerty, Doug Clifford, and Stu Cook were born in California, 1945. As young teenagers, they met at Portola Junior High School in El Cerrito, California. They immediately got on and discovered their joint passion for music. They started playing together, and in 1959 they started their own band.
Creedence started at school. Three of them, John Fogerty, Stu Cook and Doug Clifford, met at the school in El Cerrito, California, and as a result they decided to form a band.
They were called the Blue Velvets.
The Blue Velvets were an instrumental trio playing the classic jukebox-style songs. In 1960, John's older brother, Tom Fogerty, joined the lineup after 2 years as a backing singer for local bands.
And Tom Fogerty, who was older than them, joined in as the vocalist originally and then became the rhythm guitarist. And he said himself years later, I had a better voice than my younger brother, but he had the sound and style that really defined what Creedence would become.
The Blue Velvets somehow managed to score themselves a recording contract with a small independent label that, against all the odds, had managed to get itself a hit record.
The Blue Velvets released 3 singles in the San Francisco Bay Area to minimal sales. They had released these singles on Oakland's Orchestra Records.
If you listen to the Blue Velvets from this perspective, i.e. long after Creedence had made their name, you tend to hear little aspects of what Creedence were to become. Slight southern style, slight swamp music, as well as the pop instrumental style and approach of the beginning of the 1960s. In reality, they were more of the latter than they were of the former. You heard some very good players, but the songs weren't particularly good, and they were really trying to emulate and imitate the big names of the time. You can even hear at times a little bit of Elvis in there, and a little bit of Little Richard in there, and they weren't particularly inspired. But what they did have was stickability, and they went out and toured as much as they could, and the Blue Velvets were determined to make their name somehow, somewhere.
After these releases, Tom started playing the guitar and the band shifted instruments. In 1964, the band recorded a couple of tracks for a local San Francisco label, Fantasy Records. Upon signing with the label, co-owner Max Weiss changed the name of the band to the Golliwogs.
It's really weird to think of Creedence actually bending like a reed to the times. You know, the thought that Max Weiss from Fantasy Records actually suggested that they should change their name to the Golliwogs because it kind of fit the timbre of the day with this British invasion that was happening.
He, for some reason, thought the Golliwogs was a sort of name that suggested this was a member of the British invasion. This was another Beatles, Stones, Kinks. It didn't, and I'm not quite sure why the hell he thought it did. But he changed the name to the Golliwogs, taking the name from a 19th century series of stories about a puppet, a minstrel puppet called Mr. Gollywog. It was apparently supposed to be a lovable, nice character. But as time went on, of course, Gollywog itself became a derogatory term for blacks.
A, strange name. B, very questionable name if you actually know the history. See, they were still more or less a covers band. You know, the darkness, you know, the abysmal, poetic, lyrical fount that John Fogerty was capable of creating, it wasn't yet there. He had to go in the National Guard first and come back and experience the embitterment that so many people of his day had experienced. That's what made Creedence what it was. The Golliwogs, they weren't Creedence before, they were Creedence. They were a completely different band because John Fogerty came back a different man, obviously.
So you have this band in America who were trying to appeal to a wide audience in the rock and roll era, who took a very racist or seemingly racist name, which was a daft idea, and that's why the name itself didn't last long at all. I think they put 3 or 4 singles out as the Golliwogs.
Despite none of the tracks breaking out nationally, Brown Eyed Girl broke out in Miami, Florida, when it reached number 10 on the Billboard's regional breakout in 1966. During this year, the band had suffered a setback when John Fogerty and Doug Clifford were drafted into military service. They became part of the reserves of the U.S. Army and U.S. Coast Guard.
The Golliwogs were very much trying to tour, very much trying to build up a local following, trying to get on local airplay, local radio stations, which it succeeded to do to some extent. So everything was building quite well, although they really weren't having a breakout. Towards the end of their time as the Golliwogs, they finally hit in Florida. They finally had a song which broke through in Florida, and at last they began to get recognition and acknowledgement outside of the Californian borders, and it seemed that the hard work was beginning to pay off. And that's when things went into abeyance. They had to put everything on hold because John Fogerty and Doug Clifford had to be on national service. They were called up. So for a couple of years, the band did absolutely nothing, which helped them in a way because it allowed them to come back revitalized, refreshed, and to rethink everything. And at that time, Saul Zaentz took over as the owner of Fantasy Records, and that's when things really changed for what were then the Golliwogs.
Enjoying a minor level of success, John Fogerty took control of the group and started producing and writing all the band's material, including becoming lead singer of the band.
John Fogerty assuming leadership and control of the band's musical activities was absolutely the right thing to do, because he was an auteur. He could sing, he could write, he could arrange, and he could even produce. John Fogerty deciding to take control of the band's financial affairs was not such a great idea.
He was unhappy with Fantasy Records and unhappy with the way they were marketing the band. He didn't think they had any get up and go in them. He didn't believe the rest of the band really offered more than just being there, playing their instruments and virtually backing him. I know on Bad Moon Rising, he was very unhappy that Cook and Clifford tried to put on backing vocals, which failed completely, were embarrassing. Then tried to add percussion, which he thought was rubbish. So he felt, I'm the one who writes the good songs, I'm the one who's got the production vision, I'm the one who should be leader of the band, and to basically take over and drive the band. To be honest, without that happening, whatever came later in terms of bad decisions, nothing would have happened for Creedence in reality. And of course, the other interesting thing is with the band, there's no such thing as a democracy. You have to have a leader.
It's hard to guess at the resentment that, I guess some songwriters must feel, just like you see bandmates that are, probably, profiting, benefiting, from the spoils of, something that you've created. That dynamic really, really hurt Creedence, clearly, because John Fogerty felt that as the prime songwriter, as the guy who was the backbone of the band, that he should be making all the other decisions as well. I don't know if it's Napoleonic syndrome or something, but he began to want to control everything, and therein the seeds of discontent in the band were planted. The rift that would finally manifest itself in an acrimonious split that would never truly be healed. It was planted then the moment that John decided that he wasn't just a songwriter, that he was also the band leader as well. It never sat well with the rest of his bandmates.
Saul Zaentz offered them the possibility of recording a full-length album under the condition of never again using the name the Golliwogs. Never having liked the name, the band decided to change it. The group proposed 10 different names to the new owner of the label, and he enthusiastically agreed to the first one, Creedence Clearwater Revival.
Fantasy decided, right, let's do an album, but we don't like the name. We don't like the name the Golliwogs at all. It stands for the wrong image. Let's change it. So what everybody did was go away and think about what they wanted as a name. And Creedence Clearwater Revival, 3 words, or each of which has a different heritage. The name Creedence was suggested by Tom Fogerty from a mate of his, Creedence Newbell. So that's where Creedence came from. Clearwater came from an ad, a commercial in America for beer. And Revival came from the fact that they were back in action after a 2-year hiatus. So they've revived their fortunes. And they put the three together, and there we are, Creedence Clearwater Revival.
All the members quit their jobs and started an intense schedule of rehearsing and playing full-time at clubs. A single from their self-titled album, Susie Q, was chosen by radio stations for radio play, and it reached the top 40. This song, a cover of the 1956 song by rockabilly singer Dale Hawkins, would be the only top 40 hit not written by John Fogerty.
You have to remember, when the first Creedence Clearwater Revival album came out in 1968, the whole scene was different as compared to what they were doing. Very psychedelic, very hippie, very driven by a type of music, underground formations, that Creedence didn't represent at all. Here they were, coming from what we now know as Southern rock, swamp music. They were developing something that actually had a country and black bass, whereas a lot of the other music was very much experimental. So it was totally different and totally at odds with everything that was going on at the time in terms of profile and charts and commerciality.
Anyone who knows anything about Creedence knows that they've always been called a singles band, not an album band. It's not the kind of band that produces albums you sit down and listen end to end, because every song sounds like a radio single. Their first album was a quantum shift from anything that had come before, anything they'd done before the National Guard service, anything they'd done in the early 60s. All of a sudden it was possessive and embitterment and a kind of a righteous indignation at the political state of the times that just kind of came through. It was a kind of a new kind of blues. It was a new kind of discontent. It was kind of like I guess the musical equivalent of a fracture that was happening in American society. It was heavy, it was loud, it was dangerous, it was completely rock and roll, but above all else, it was the blues. It was sadness.
The album was quite light on what were later to be considered Fogerty classics, but it still sold pretty well and more than justified Fantasy Records continuing to support them.
But he got a mixed response. A lot of people understood and appreciated what they were trying to do, while other people were a little bit, what the hell is going on here? But they did have a hit with Susie Q, a cover of Susie Q, which I think I'm right in saying is the only time Creedence had a hit with someone else's song outside of John Fogerty. And they also did a really good cover of Screaming Joe Hawkins' I Put a Spell on You. So there was certainly enough on the album to catch enough people's attention to suggest that here was a band doing something a little different, but in a good way, not in a negative way.
The next year would become pivotal in CCR's success. 1969 was a year that marked an entire generation in America. The babies from the years of World War II were now young adults and had a unique vision about their future and the world.
As the MC5 put it, 69 American terminal stasis, the air's so thick it's like drowning in molasses. You know, the Stooges saying it's 1969 okay all across the USA.
I wish I could say that I lived in 1969. I mean, just like, if ever a year evoked people's imagination, it has to be that. The amount of stories, the idea that 12 months could contain as much as it did.
Here's a bit of the bleeding obvious. It came right after 1968. And what happened in 1968? Dr. Martin Luther King assassinated. Bobby Kennedy assassinated. You know, escalation of the Vietnam War. The riot in Chicago where the police smashed 7 shades of used food out of peaceful demonstrators at the Democratic Convention. Nixon was elected. 1969. He took office.
You're talking about Woodstock. You're talking about the moment that the Vietnam War absolutely went south. Man landing on the moon. Everything was happening in the States. It was the height of the civil rights movement. I mean, just like if ever there was a fracture, a disjuncture between an idyllic period and the nightmare that came afterward, it would have had to have been 1969. And the music was just so incredible.
1969 will always be regarded as one of the pivotal years in the 20th century. Pivotal years in the development of rock music. Because, of course, Woodstock happened. and it was suddenly peace, love and understanding everywhere. Everybody wanted to be a part of this scene. There were so many exciting young bands coming out and around, and you had the likes of Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath and Deep Purple beginning to make their mark. You had Vanilla Fudge beginning to make their mark, and Iron Butterfly. So many bands were coming through at the time. It was a melting pot. Anything was possible. And I think 69 opened up the horizons for people, because a lot of people realized and believed we can play anything we want. We can do anything we want. The album format was starting to happen, which meant that you didn't have to rely just on 3-minute singles. You could now do 15, 20-minute songs if you wanted to. There was nothing stopping you. So everything was starting to happen.
Creedence had this kind of sound, this anger, and a soul that was so of its era, so of its time. John Fogerty, he wasn't just a great songwriter, he was a voice for an absolute generation, a disadvantaged one. Not just the kids who were out at Woodstock, but also the ones that had gone to fight in the war as well.
And it's rarely acknowledged nowadays, so it was obvious at the time, what a great political songwriter John Fogerty was. I mean, a song like, say, Run Through the Jungle was massively popular with the troops in Vietnam.
I mean, he spoke for people that weren't popular at the time, people that went over and they were confronted by a so-called police action that they didn't necessarily want to be a part of. I mean, the draft just wasn't criminal. It wasn't just wrong. It was also unfair to a lot of people. That he spoke for them as well, I think, is what made him just so powerful an artist. And that's why his song and his voice just still resonates today. It's because he was a legend and he was in a field of one.
Creedence really threw themselves headlong and said, you know what, we can have success on our own terms because people want bands who were not prepared to compromise. And Creedence weren't compromising. They were doing exactly what John Fogerty envisioned them doing, and exactly what the rest of them were happy to do. And as Fogerty once said, I'm not prepared to go back to filling gas at a pump station. I want to be out there making money from touring and making records.
Their second album, Bayou Country, became a #7 platinum hit. It would be the first of several hit albums and singles for the next 3 years of their career. The single Proud Mary peaked at #2 on the national Billboard charts. This single will become the group's most covered song, including a cover by Ike and Tina Turner.
Proud Mary was the real breakthrough with Creedence in terms of being a John Fogerty song that got them into the charts on their own terms. It was apparently written by him 2 days after he left national service, so it was very much fresh in his mind. And he's talked about Proud Mary in terms of, I was a washerwoman I knew called Mary, so I just used her name. But it also set the scene of the style, the anthemic, simple choruses, which Creedence made their own over such a long period of time. Simple melody, but well constructed and well played, and importantly, well produced. You don't listen to Proud Mary now and you think, production lets it down, it's a really good song. You actually listen to it, and the production is of its time, and it's timeless. It's almost done live in the studio. And it was perfect for radio, because it really did instantly hook you in. John Fogerty had and has that ability to get you immediately with the opening chords of a song, and then really builds it up like a melodrama. So it was a very short melodrama.
I mean, Proud Mary is an incredible song. I mean, it's not just that, it's a tune, but the fact that it's been interpreted by the likes of Tina Turner and Elton John, I mean, it just speaks volumes of, the accord that it's given, not just by fans, but by fellow musicians as well. I mean, for Creedence, it was absolutely the breakthrough, It was soulful, it was blues, it was rock and roll, it was just something else. The thing is, Creedence have always had a southern twang to what they do, but it was the fact that the Blue Velvets, as the Golliwogs, the people that would become Creedence Clearwater Revival, were practitioners of loads of jazz and blues and rockabilly standards. It really shined through. Now, I heard the story that John Fogerty actually, it's one of 3 songs that he wrote in a couple of days after he got out of National Guard service, and it showed. He'd been thinking about music, but more importantly, he'd been listening to it as well. And when he came back, he was a fully formed genius. And that song is absolutely one of the best songs of all time.
there are lots of people who didn't grow up in the American South who've written great songs about it and identified with it. I mean, the band, apart from Lee Von Helm, you know, they're all Canadians. The Rolling Stones, who were Brits. So you have Creedence, who are basically California boys, who are totally Southern identified, with songs like Born on the Bayou, and indeed Proud Mary. Proud Mary is unique for one particular reason. It's the only Creedence song which they don't entirely own. They share it with Ike and Tina Turner. And legend hath it that after all those years of not playing any Creedence songs during his solo career, somebody took John Fogerty aside and said, you better start doing this live again, because otherwise everybody's going to think that Ike and Tina wrote it.
Their breakthrough was monumental, and all over the US, CCR were now seen as a genuine Southern rock band. In the spring of '69, Creedence Clearwater Revival released two of their most iconic songs, Bad Moon Rising and Lottie. The singles peaked at number 2 just before the releases of their third album, Green River, in August of '69. They toured throughout the US, and of course the Woodstock Festival organizers could not have their mythical rock fest without one of the hottest bands of the year.
Woodstock itself has become iconic over the years. The Woodstock Music Festival has become one of the landmark occasions and incidents in the history of rock music, in the history of music. If you're looking at cultural phenomena in the 20th century, Woodstock will certainly be on your list of the top 10, maybe top 15, because it was such a vast success and it captured the imagination, not just of America, but of the world. And it introduced the world to so many different brilliant artists who went on to make their name or enhance their name because of it. And of course, it was supposed to be a big festival, but 100,000 or so, which became legendarily 1 million plus people turned up because everything was torn down in terms of payment. And that sort of crowd turning up, we will never see again. But it became a cultural, social sensation, which to this day still resonates.
History has led lots of people to believe that the only artists who played at Woodstock were the ones who were in the movie. And, you know, there are in fact quite a few performers who did Woodstock and weren't in the movie for a whole variety of reasons. You know, one was that, you know, the everything dragged on so long and there were so many people there and it was so hard to get in and out of the place that, you know, a lot of the cameras broke down, a lot of the times they ran out of film. There were some artists, like Janis Joplin and Paul Butterfield, who weren't in the movie because their manager, Albert Grossman, suddenly started asking for an awful lot of money for them to be in. The Grateful Dead weren't in the movie, which is probably just as well because it would have been a 10-hour movie if they had been. And in fact, one reason why Creedence, who played, and nobody knows this except pretty much serious rock geeks and the people who were there, is that they went on after the Dead, and the Dead, who had that kind of LSD induced, elongated sense of time, did a set that went on for several centuries, and they didn't get off the stage till 3 a.m. So Creedence, who was supposed to be headlining that night, didn't get to play till 3 a.m. Now, Creedence were a rock and roll band. Most of the time, they played short songs that you could get up and dance to. The problem is that at 3 a.m, nobody except people who were doing speed had any inclination to want to get up and dance, and frankly anybody who wasn't doing speed was probably asleep. So they ended up, instead of playing to a joyfully rocking crowd of 500,000 plus people, they ended up playing to a row of to endless expanse of sleeping bags, and the PA was probably drowned out by the snoring.
It was overcrowded, it was uncomfortable, the weather was horrible, it was really badly organized, and one of the most legendary festivals of all time, undeniably. Creedence's performance there clearly wasn't, and John Fogerty decided that it just wasn't up to scratch. They played late, the weather was bad, and he just didn't want it included. Now, I mean, considering what we know about Woodstock now, I mean, just like it's this event that's up there with Moses coming down with the Ten Commandments in terms of music history, one of the greatest fests of all time. But at that time, Creedence were already huge, and Fogerty probably went, you know what, we don't need it, man. It wasn't our best show. Let's just do another one.
Thank you. Look. Hey, can you get that thing on? Is it on now? Get it going.
The prolific band continued to work hard, this time to create enough tracks to use on their fourth album. With a release in November '69, CCR had released 3 albums within one civil year, which meant an incredible amount of success for the group. In 1969, the band had 3 top 10 albums, 4 hit singles with 3 additional charting B-sides. There was no surprise that they were invited to perform at the Ed Sullivan Show at the end of that year. The show was one of the most successful and iconic shows in American TV history, and the band performed the singles Down on the Corner and The Fortunate Son.
The image of Ed Sullivan and Creedence on the same stage, I mean, it's just got to be one of the most hilarious, polarized images that you've ever seen in the history of Western culture. You have Ed Sullivan, this relic, this iconic presenter, who represented everything about America that was conservative, that was sort of buttoned to the top button, that was well-groomed, that, had values. And on the other side of the stage, Creedence Clearwater Revival. I mean, a band headed up by a guy who was one of America's fiercest critics. You might have called him patriotic, but you'd also call him a guy who was capable of speaking for really disgruntled people. The people who had faced the draft, the people who'd gone to fight the Vietnam War, those lucky enough to came back scarred for life, traumatized by the horrors witnessed over there in this unjust so-called police action. He wrote a song about it, Fortunate Son. It was about people who could get out of the draft. They weren't fortunate enough. They weren't born with a silver spoon in their hand. They had to go fight a war that they didn't want to be a part of. The idea of them singing that song in opposition to a guy who represented everything about America that was conservative, man, what an image. That was a revolution, and it happened on TV. It was televised. Some folks are born made to wear the flag. Ooh, they're red, white, and blue. And when the band plays Hail to the Chief, ooh, they point the cannon at you.
It basically seems absurd now that so many rock and roll greats were introduced to a mass audience by something as the term used to be, square, as the Ed Sullivan Show, something so tame, something so conservative, something so family oriented. But hey, it worked for Elvis, it worked for the Beatles, it even worked for the Rolling Stones and the Doors. And what Creedence appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show playing Fortunate Son, which is, one of their angriest songs, and one of one of the ones with lyrics that would be least likely to appeal to rock-ribbed Republicans and supporters of the Vietnam War.
Fortunate Son is an interesting song because a lot of people take it as an anti-war song. It isn't. It's an anti-establishment attitude to war song. John Fogerty came out of the National Service and never forgot about ex-servicemen and the people he served with. And he felt that a lot of these people were treated so shabbily and badly in normal life, in civilian life. And he was angry at the fact that the establishment, the elite, sent others off to do their fighting for them and just stayed out comfortably in the shade. And the incident which inspired the song was Dwight Eisenhower's grandson, David Eisenhower, marrying Richard Nixon's daughter, Julie Nixon. And he felt that really summed up the whole elitism at the time when Vietnam was going on and American soldiers were being sent out to die. Here were these two elite people who were part of the reason the Vietnam War was started in the first place, who just stood back and could just bask in their own riches and be completely cut off from the reality and the ravages of war. That's where the whole inspiration for the song came from. You can say rightly or wrongly that Fogerty should have stood up and been very much more anti-war in his message, but he was anti the way people were being, normal people were being treated by the establishment, and that in itself was quite a significant tactic, I think.
But it was part of the magic of Creedence that, they, long hair and all, they looked so down home. They looked so, they looked so heartland and mother country that they could sing this stuff and not be shot by rednecks when they left the studio.
The band was sailing the high seas of success and recognition. Their fame and music was now reaching lands far beyond their own borders. After featuring on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine in February 1970, CCR began preparing their European tour. John Fogerty wrote Up Around the Bend and Run Through the Jungle to support their live tour. The single was released and reached number 4.
Remember, my son reminded me of this. My son Shane, about a week ago, there was a time when Creedence was just going to head off to a European tour, and I felt that we needed a new single out. We were really kind of lighting the woods on fire at that point, and so I had to come up with 2 sides of a 45 within 7 days and get it written and rehearsed and recorded. And the record, I of course finalized the mix, but I never actually saw the 45 until we were in Europe. That was Up Around the Bend and Run Through the Jungle.
Up Around the Bend was a later hit for Creedence Clearwater Revival, and later on became successful because so many bands including Had Our Rocks covered it. Now it's a song that was more about being on the road. It wasn't a song with a really big social message. It was about life on the road for a band, about life in America in the early 70s for people of that generation. And it was such a good song again because it immediately captured your attention. It had that ability which Fogerty had to open up with certain chords that hooked you in, and then the chorus comes later on as a sucker punch. So it is a beautifully constructed song and one of the best songs on Cosmo's Factory, which was one of the biggest albums that the band were ever to have. And it's a great pop song, but it's also a great rock song, and I think laid a template for a lot of what came later in America, in Americana, and the way a lot of bands, such as Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, were to construct their music, and I think Up Around the Bend has a lot to do with it.
In the summer of that year, the band decided to go back to their San Francisco studio to record their 5th album, Cosmo's Factory. The title was an inside joke regarding the band's factory work ethic mentality. Also, Cosmo was Doug Clifford's nickname due to his interest in the cosmos. The album was released in July 1970, only a month after recording. This album was marked by having their last #2 national hit, Looking Out My Back Door. The recording sessions for this album were marked by episodes of tension between the band members.
By the time Creedence were actually recording Cosmo's Factory, it was obvious that the riffs in the band were becoming more and more apparent. You know, this disjuncture between John and Tom, these brothers divided by this decision of John to not only head up the band, but to write all the songs despite how much Tom wanted to contribute. It was going to reach its apex.
I guess it's inevitable in a band that is successful, at least partly because of the singular vision of one member. Fogerty used to complain that, you know, they'd come in, lay the backing tracks, and that would be all that the rhythm guitar, bass and drums, and that would be all they'd have to do with the record until the mix was finished and it was time to go out and play live, because, you know, he would overdub all the other instruments, sing all the backing vocals, having written the songs, produce it and mix it. But it's all. But you know, the other three, probably because they were older and they remembered him as the kid, began to get resentful. You know, the fact that they were selling platinum all over the place. That they were one of the absolute most successful groups in the entire country, almost precisely because Fogerty's instincts were right on the money, and his skills were sufficient for him to act on those instincts and have it pay off.
The band demanded a more democratic process. However, John felt it would threaten the success of the band. A good example of how John controlled the band with an iron fist was during a 1970 gig in Nebraska. John Fogerty made the decision that the band would no longer do encores at live shows.
He can't have been an easy guy to get along with, you know. I mean, A, he was a perfectionist. B, he wanted to control every aspect of Creedence, not just the music that they were writing, but also how they were performing. The decision not to do encores, I kind of get. In a way, it was punk rock. I think he didn't want to be predictable. I think the thing that led him to that decision was that they had done a show where they had done like 17 encores or something like that. And I guess in his mind, he thought it was silly, it was predictable, kind of crass. And in a time before punk rock, he was doing the most punk rock thing of all.
Despite all their internal fights, CCR released another album in December 1970, spawning the top 10 hit, Have You Ever Seen the Rain?
Have You Ever Seen the Rain was one of the last great Creedence Clearwater Revival songs. It came from the Pendulum album, which is Tom Fogerty's last album. And people have always felt, oh, it's about war. It's an anti-war song. Rain means bombs or bullets. And therefore it's sort of, have you seen bombs and bullets? We've got to stop this. In actuality, it was much closer to home, because it was really about the fact that the band were cracking up. It was John Fogerty basically saying the rain is the disintegration of Creedence Clearwater Revival. And pretty much him saying to the rest of the band, and also to the rest of the world, we are falling apart here, and if we're not careful, we're not going to last for very much longer. So it's much more personal than people actually give it credit for.
The album was not as successful as their predecessors, and it increased the already high pressure in the band. CCR would go on to face the darkest period of their career. Tired of having to deal with his younger brother, Tom Fogerty resigned from the band. The group considered a replacement for Tom, but eventually decided to continue as a trio.
I don't think that Tom Fogerty could have stayed in the band. You know, I mean, the fact was, he was writing loads of music. He wanted to be more than just a backing vocalist and a rhythm guitarist, you know. He wanted to take center stage, you know. I mean, they were equals on stage to everybody but the band themselves. I mean, you know, the fact is John wanted so much control. You can kind of see his frustration. I mean, just like it isn't just about, you know, what you want to do as a musician. It's also about your pride as a man. I mean, the fact that, you know, he was prevented from contributing anything productive to the band is just, it seems kind of harsh, kind of unfair. I guess Creedence, you know, they couldn't have existed in any other way. I mean, just like they were the product of these titanic forces within the band. John and the rest of the guys, you can't blame Tom for leaving. The fact is, it doomed the band.
In 1971, John Fogerty decided to change the approach on how the band was managed. He proposed to Doug Clifford and Stu Cook that a more democratic approach was necessary, and decided that each member would write and perform his own material, and John would only lend his rhythmic guitar to their songs. Initially, Clifford and Cook resisted the arrangement. However, John threatened to quit if they refused.
He suddenly told Stu Cook and Doug Clifford, who were the two guys left, of course, right, for Mardi Gras, which was to be their last album, although they didn't know it at the time, I want you involved to the point where all three of us are going to write equally. We're going to do songs separately, and we're going to write equally. We're going to produce it equally. And all I'm going to do on the songs that you write is play guitar. I'm not playing any of the other instruments that I can play. So basically, it's a three-way split. Ironically, Cook and Clifford didn't like it. And if you think about the fact that they spent a couple of years fighting Fogerty for that sort of control, they suddenly said, no, we don't want this. Mainly because I think they felt he was doing it out of viciousness, out of a feeling of trying to prove a point, which he did do to some extent, because the two hit singles from Mardi Gras were both written by John Fogerty. None of the others had that sort of success, and in reality, Mardi Gras was a disappointing album commercially and artistically, because the others didn't have John Fogerty's ability to write. But they felt it was a very malignant approach by John Fogerty. That's why they didn't want to do it, but he forced them to do it.
The next CCR album, Mardi Gras, would be their last after being a critical failure, with Rolling Stone's John Landau stating, "It is the worst album I have ever heard from a major rock band."
To call Mardi Gras a failure is comparative. It got to number 12 in the American charts, for instance, not exactly a disaster. But if you consider that Creedence were used to number 1 albums, or certainly top 2 albums, for that to get to number 12 was really a sign that the fans weren't impressed with what had been done. And in reality, it's not a very good album. Someday Never Comes, which was a big hit, was a John Fogerty song on the album, and it's a very good song. And strangely, although he says it was written about the fact his parents got divorced when he was very young, and that his father said, one day you'll understand why everything happened. And then he found himself saying to his younger son, who was 4 years old at the time, when he went on the road, why are you away for so much? One day you'll understand. I think it's actually about the fact that the band were falling apart, and he probably knew this was it. He wasn't going to go any further. And Sweet Hitchhiker, which was the other hit on the album, again, John Fogerty's song, is again really good in the old vein, although it does miss Tom Fogerty's rhythm guitar and what Tom Fogerty brought to the table. And that's the big thing you notice. I'd actually liken it to Richard Beckinsale in Rising Damp, is you don't realise how good Richard Beckinsale was when everyone talks about Leonard Rossiter until he died and wasn't there anymore, and he realised that the balance had been lost. And people didn't realise how good Tom Fogerty was for Creedence until he wasn't there, because everyone always praised John Fogerty for his brilliant musicianship, his fantastic production, and his expert songwriting. But you notice the absence of Tom Fogerty hugely, because without that guidance, without that simplicity he gave it, something was distinctly missing. And really, the band had nowhere else to go, because they were never going to cope without him. It was a four-legged animal with one leg missing.
At this point, John Fogerty was not only against his bandmates, but also against his label, Fantasy Records. He felt the label had not fulfilled the promise of improving the band's contract. Cook, who had a degree in business, stated that because of Fogerty's poor judgment when signing with Fantasy Records, CCR had to respect the worst record deal of any major American recording artist. Despite the weak success of Mardi Gras, the group embarked on a 20-date tour across the U.S. 6 months after the tour had finished, Fantasy Records officially announced the disbandment of CCR. They were the pillars of Southern rock expansion. They had a legion of fans all over the globe, and by 1972, they were no more, and never again would they reunite.
So I think the world reacted in terms of, oh, that's a shame. But I think because they were never seen as a major band on the level of a Led Zeppelin, or on the level of a Deep Purple, or on the level of an Emerson, Lake and Palmer, all of which were British bands, admittedly, but there were enough major American acts. They never really had the impact to make people go, oh my God, it's all over. I think the general reaction was, Creedence has split up, it's a real shame, but oh well, they'll move on. So it didn't have the same importance and impact in the public side that it should have had. And who knows what might have happened had things carried on. Tom Fogerty may have returned, we just don't know. It's all ifs and ands, perhaps and maybes. But definitely the reaction of people was shrug of the shoulders a little bit, and part of the reason for that was Mardi Gras wasn't very good. So people may have thought, well, they've reached the end of the cycle.
The band members continued their careers independently from each other, pursuing their own solo successes. In 1973, John Fogerty began his solo career when he released the Blue Ridge Rangers, a compilation of country and gospel songs. Despite his ideas of going solo, Fogerty still owed 8 more albums to Fantasy Records, according to his original contract with the label. Because he was at war with the label, Fogerty refused to work with them, and for 10 years, he didn't release a single under the label. His older brother, Tom Fogerty, released the album Zephyr National in 1974. This album was the last to feature all 4 members of CCR. The track, Joyful Resurrection, was very much in line with the CCR style, and it became the last track in which the 4 members worked on. During the 80s, several lawsuits and countersuits increased the animosity between them. But this decade would also mark the return of the creative genius behind CCR. John Fogerty, who had refused to write and release new songs, finally had the break he was waiting for. Asylum Records, owned by David Geffen, bought Fogerty's contract from Fantasy Records for $1 million, allowing him to start creating new material. His solo album, Centerfield, was hugely successful in 1985. It topped the charts during that year. Fogerty went on tour in 1986. However, many of his fans complained about the fact that Fogerty refused to sing old CCR hits during his live shows. He explained his refusal by stating that if he had done so, he would have had to have paid royalties to Saul Zaentz, which he wasn't willing to do. Eventually, Bob Dylan convinced Fogerty to start playing his old hits again by saying that if Fogerty continued to refuse to play them, everyone will think Proud Mary is a Tina Turner song. In October 1987, John Fogerty played some of his CCR hits alongside Dylan and George Harrison at the Palomino Club in Los Angeles. Only 3 years after Fogerty's performance at the Palomino Club, his older brother and former CCR member Tom Fogerty passed away. Tom Fogerty died of an AIDS complication in September 1990 after having received an infected blood transfusion during his back surgery.
The passing away of Tom Fogerty, completely tragic, horrible circumstances. 1991 was a time when AIDS wasn't really comprehended as a disease, as this horrible thing that was ravaging the planet. Still carried with it an incredible social stigma as well. I can't imagine how horribly that would have affected John, not just because they never reconciled as bandmates, but as brothers as well. I mean, just like, in a way, it could cite Creedence to history. I mean, no matter what would happen after that point, they could never exist as a band again. And that probably did a lot to influence the fact that John just couldn't take the stage with the rest of the bandmates. It wasn't because he didn't want to be with them. It's because his brother wasn't there.
John and Tom never reconciled with each other. And in Tom's eulogy, John said, "We wanted to grow up and be musicians. I guess we achieved half of that. Becoming rock and roll stars. We didn't necessarily grow." After a long period of musical inactivity, Stu Cook and Doug Clifford went on to create the Creedence Clearwater Revisited group. After the 1993 induction, everyone was asking for a reunion that would never happen. Even in 2013, In an interview with Charlie Rose at CBS This Morning, John Fogerty stated he would be open to a reunion. However, he wasn't actively seeking one, and he didn't feel Cook and Clifford would be interested in doing so. Even after 30 years of the band's breakup, the members of CCR still stand with their backs toward each other. Millions of fans all over the world still hope for a reconciliation, but for now, all they have is the records, the videos, and their dreams. The relationship between them might have been broken into pieces. Their music, however, will forever live on as an extension of their loyal fans, who've introduced their children and grandchildren to the sounds of the band once known as the greatest band in the world.
People should recognise John Fogerty for being a supreme songwriter, but someone who also, as a producer, brought out the best from the other members of the band. And while he wrote the songs, the others contributed equally in the arrangements and the way they played them. And let's face it, everyone can hum Creedence songs, everyone knows the Creedence songs. Even if they don't know the names, they'll know the songs.
Creedence Clearwater Revival music is a sacred tome. It's like a time capsule from an era gone by, and it'll never be duplicated. It'll never be exceeded. And if you don't understand Creedence, you just don't understand what rock and roll is.
They are one of the most important bands in music history and will forever be an inspiration for generations of artists. They are CCR, Creedence Clearwater Revival.